Tonight, we start with the Roman Colosseum's perverse spectacle, a sight where inmates were tossed into the arena with subtlety. Lions were ravenous, and fairness was optional. Please take a time to like and subscribe to the video before you settle in. Please let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. But only if you actually love what I do here. Seeing who is joining us from across the globe is always exciting. Turn down the lights now. For that gentle background hum, you might want to turn on a fan. And let's take it slow as we go on our adventure tonight. For the Roman Colosseum, in addition to being a showpiece, it could have served as an excuse for emperors to avoid handling real paperwork. We have soccer stadiums nowadays. For disorder, the Romans had stadiums. You would be as disappointed as someone who came a picnic to a rainstorm if you entered the Colosseum expecting fairness. Balance was not what the audience sought. Their purpose was not to witness the finest fighter. Their goal was to see who could fall the most, preferably in the most spectacular manner. Extra points for sorrowful face, expressions, and flailing. Arms. The Romans had a strong definition of amusement. Let's face it, a well-trained gladiator duel with a perfect match. Yes, it did occur. The opening acts, however, were far more prevalent. Criminals, prisoners, or unfortunate individuals who just so happened to owe money to the wrong senator. These people were instructed to make it dramatic and were given the equivalent of a sharp spoon, and they made it theatrical. It was more than simply a stadium at the Colosseum. It served as civic therapy. Ancient Rome was a hard place to live. Grain shortages, plagues, and the odd fire. People survived by seeing someone else suffer a really awful day in a safe setting, and it was free. The emperor provided funding for the games, which were a highly visible "please like me" gesture. You had a seat, grain, and a view of a person fleeing from a furious elephant. What more is there to ask for? Inequality was even promoted by the architecture. The best seat belonged to the emperor. Everyone else received a stone bench and sunstroke, while senators received pillows. They had an audience, the real people in the arena. Therefore, fairness isn't really the top concern in design. This was not a bout of fencing. This was the equivalent of dinner theater in ancient Rome. If the show finished with yelling, and your meal consisted of fried dormice, your win-loss ratio was not used to evaluate you if you were a participant. You were judged by the volume of the audience as you fell straight into a net after tripping over your own foot, forcing an unskilled layman to engage in combat with a fully equipped professional in front of 50,000 strangers is the epitome of public service. This amusement was known by a term from the Romans. Additionally, they wanted something with a little bit more risk and a lot less regulations. Even though we have game shows and food competitions. Now for the gladiator versus amateur contest. An endearing custom in which a skilled murderer battled. For example, a baker brandishing a sword, or a bureaucrat experiencing an existential crisis. These were not isolated errors. They were prearranged. The amateurs were occasionally volunteers. Sometimes they were merely men who should have read the tiny print, and other times they were criminals who had been sentenced. Despite the logic of contemporary film, gladiators weren't always slaves. All of them had extensive training, and some were celebrities, and others were volunteers. They had coaches, lived in schools, and were essentially professional athletes, minas. The endorsement agreements and more armor. Imagine now putting one of them up against someone who watched shadows on a wall to learn how to wield a sword. The idea was that the outcome was predictable. There was no suspense here. It was a spectacle. A fair battle was not what the spectators wanted. They wanted to pretend the other person had a chance and applaud for the clear winner. It was like witnessing a squirrel attempt to operate a chariot in ancient Roman culture. The amateur, on the other hand, had choices. The first option is to live long enough to be somewhat remarkable. The second option is to live long enough for the public to sympathize with you. Option 3. Be struck so fast and forcefully that the emperor nods in agreement and the crowd chuckles. You may even get a respite if you are very charming or theatrical. Romans like a good yarn about the underdog, particularly if the underdog was bleeding just enough. However, the result was usually decided before the game started. The audience was aware of it. The combatants were aware of it. Most likely, even the man cleaning the sand was aware of it. Imagine being charged with a crime in ancient Rome. Perhaps you took something. Perhaps you spent too much time staring at the statue of the emperor. Perhaps you are just disliked by your neighbor. Well done. You are now eligible for a special Colosseum appearance. By special appearance, we imply that you will get to see a lion up close, directly, and most likely without prior notice. The crucial issue was posed by the Roman custom known as damnatio ad bestias, or sentence to the animals. What if the legal system was a zoo as well? Rome used it to deal with anything from treason to robbery. Open a gate, toss the accused into the arena, start the music, and let the hysteria begin. Nor were the lions your typical felines. They were regarded like celebrities and were brought from North Africa. They sometimes had better food and better transportation than the majority of the population. In the meanwhile, the prisoner received a tunic and a hazy feeling of impending doom. Nothing speaks justice like giving someone a twig and instructing them to make it appear thrilling. Hence, there should be no armor, no weapon, and perhaps a stick. There was no combat here, was a message. The Empire included you in the spectacle rather than only punishing you. The Emperor smiled, the audience roared, and everyone forgot their rent was past due. The more theatrical your last minutes were. Yes, people did bring their kids, because you could teach your children important life skills like don't commit fraud or you'll be lunch instead of going to the forum. Everyone was astonished by the condemned at times. They climbed objects, ran, and avoided obstacles. At least one story describes a guy who played dead so effectively that the lion became disinterested. Sadly, the audience didn't. They ensured that the performance continued. If this sounds excessive to you, the Romans would have concurred. However, it would have destroyed the aesthetic if you had recommended against employing lions. Let's pretend the fans have had enough of seeing defenseless convicts become friends with destiny after the lion match. What comes next? Let's equip a few and send them back in, of course, but with more and stranger creatures. If the wild was very irritated and the man was wearing gladiator sandals, then step in the venues, Rome's version of man against nature. These were simulated hunts in which highly skilled combatants. Let's face it, anybody who was available and owed no favors were armed and instructed. Try not to look nervous. They would turn the Colosseum into a make-believe wilderness, imported sand, fake trees, and maybe some vegetation if funds allowed. After that, wild animals were let go. Anything that might stomp, charge, or profoundly perplex an audience, including crocodiles, rhinos, bears, ostriches, and leopards. It was expected of fighters to fight them with spears, nets, or sometimes nothing at all. Men have reportedly been sent in brandishing sticks or slings, which works just as well as shouting, "Please stop," at a charging pig. This is where the twist lies. Even if it was going in the other way, the conflict was still unfair. To keep everything under control, the animals were sometimes ill, given drugs, or starved. At other occasions, they were just thrown into the midst of mayhem without knowing whether they were meant to attack or try out for a tragedy. It didn't really matter. Survival was not the aim. It was a show. Did the animals matter to the crowd? Not very. They rejoiced as a rhino successfully flipped a guy into the air like a fancy coin. They applauded more loudly if the guy won in. Anyway, there was just amusement no loss. And sometimes the animals formed a team. According to one story, a lion and a bear began fighting after ignoring the people. The audience loved it. Most likely, the organizer received a promotion. Hunting was not the purpose. It wasn't battle. When an empire becomes wealthy enough to create new pastimes and bored enough to transform the food chain into improv theater, this is what happens. The Roman Colosseum had developed a motif by this point. Make something gruesome more bizarre way. However, they turned to mythology when they want to make a lasting impression on the audience. For why just put someone to death when you might make a legend in the process? They called this fun custom fatal charades. Unfortunately, it wasn't a game. Rather, it was a method of public execution that combined creative punishment with narrative. Imagine a condemned man fitted with false wings, dressed as Icarus, and tossed from a platform. He didn't really fly. It wasn't subtle at all. Mythology, gods, heroes, and tragic ends were all very popular with the Romans. They thus recreated criminals' deaths as performances rather than coping with them in silence. In addition to seeing justice, the audience was also witnessing art, state-fumed art that is violent. For example, the tale of Prometheus. He has a persistent ego issue and is shackled to a rock in myth. They utilized stage props instead of the rock in the Colosseum. However, the ego was genuine. The tragic musician Orpheus, for example, attempted to save his bride from the underworld. In the Roman version, a guy with a harp and a tunic crosses the arena. Then a few big, utterly disinterested beasts are discreetly released. Music wasn't the end of it. Naturally, the audience adored it. At last, entertainment and culture come together in one. When the man wearing the Apollo wig stumbled over his shoes, you might still laugh and point, feeling sophisticated for having recognized the tale. Were the original tales faithfully portrayed in these performances? Not even close. But it wasn't about accuracy. It was a spectacle. Great if they were able to recall the story. Otherwise, they just made up a new version in which Hercules loses a foot. These were not plays, to be clear. The actors weren't the performers. They had been given death sentences and were now supposed to assist in making a narrative come to life before leaving it in the last act. Despite the fact that someone had just been Zeused from a scaffold, the emperor's well-timed nod and the gratified audience felt a bit more civilized. There was no curtain call or clapping. Rome said, "What if we made it a lake?" Just when you thought the Colosseum couldn't be any more extravagant. Indeed, throughout its early history, the Colosseum held simulated naval combat known as maki, because simulating a nautical conflict in a structure that is far from the sea is the next natural step after turning executions into a theater. Not with symbolism, but with real water, the type that makes boats float and unskilled sailors panic. Roman engineers, who obviously had both competence and too much time, found out how to flood the arena floor. It was an easy strategy. Occupy the floor, bring in a few ships, and engage in combat with actual persons who often knew less about rowing than the spectators. These simulated conflicts sometimes recreated well-known maritime conflicts. At other occasions, teams of prisoners were simply instructed to row, fight, and try not to look like you've never seen an oar before. Let's also discuss those boats. Of course, they were smaller than actual battleships. See how far you can go when you attempt to squeeze a whole fleet inside an amphitheater. However, because they were still armed with paint, flags, and actual weapons, there was a strong risk that someone would fall in, be shoved in, or just leap in because it looked like the best course of action. From above, the crowd gazed in equal parts confusion and enjoyment, like cruise guests watching a buffet fire. Naval tactics were of little interest to anybody. They wanted to see whether there was a spectacular fall from the boat. Extra points if they let out a lyrical scream while they performed. Indeed, there were dramatic moments. Fighters jumping across decks, ships clashing, and individuals inadvertently jabbing spears at their teammates. To be honest, it was more airy anarchy with costumes than naval strategy. The Colosseum eventually ceased filling up for these performances, most likely because it has been shown that water and old concrete are not the most compatible long-term partners. However, Romans enjoyed their laughter, splashing, and sea skirmishes for a time, even though half of the participants were unable to steer and the other half were unable to swim. Even manufactured fighting wasn't always dramatic enough. At that point, the party bundle was released by the organizers. Shackles, blindfolds, mismatched weaponry, and a general lack of respect for common sense or the rules of physics. Why? Because being fair is boring. However, it's funny for everyone, save the person wearing the blindfold, to see someone attempt to fight while wearing one, making a perfectly capable fighter's life far more difficult for entertaining purposes. Was one common variation: take off their armor, make their weapon shorter, or give them something absolutely worthless, such as a wooden sword, or worse, a net. Entering the arena with what is essentially a stick from a kid's toy set says good luck more than anything else. Then the chains appeared. Occasionally, fighters were shackled by their wrists, ankles, or both. Because it is obvious that being physically restrained is what you actually need if you have previously prepared to survive an armed combat in front of thousands of people. Additionally, it greatly increases the interpretative value of avoiding. Some were bound together and made to fight, indeed, to one another. The three-legged race of doom was the name given to it. Well, not in a formal sense, but it ought to have been. Imagine attempting to survive while your footwork is dictated by someone else's terror. The audience goes crazy when one stumbles and both collapse. Naturally, not everyone was subjected to these tricks. Gladiators were investments. Unless the audience was bored and the emperor desired a good laugh. The most absurd arrangements were reserved for those who attracted large audiences and had a solid reputation. Then everything was up for grabs. Not to mention the sporadic, unexpected adversary. Just when you think you're up against one man, a trap door opens, and a second one more. Better still, something with claws merges. Consider a WWE bout in which a bear is spit out at random from the floor. That was what ancient Rome did, but truly, since there was only a checklist and no rule book, none of this was covered in it. Is it amusing? Is that ridiculous? It's possible to clear things up before the following game. In all its chaotic genius, one would think that the Roman Colosseum provided its audience with a respite in between acts. Take a minute to relax, eat some olives, and perhaps discuss how beautifully the gladiators were dressed. Indeed, there was an interlude in theory. However, even that was transformed into a show in typical Roman way. Greetings from the lunchtime break, the meridiani. Nothing goes with your midday bread roll, quite like the empire's concept of due process. Therefore, lunchtime was set aside for something a bit more procedural. Public executions, even while the morning offered gladiator gems and the afternoon beast hunts. These were not impromptu executions. They were meticulously planned, coordinated, and timed like a theatrical performance. In order for the public to witness justice being administered openly and without any red tape. The condemned, typically criminals, deserters, or those who had irritated the wrong bureaucrat were brought out. Drama was not anticipated. There was no combat here. It served as a warning. The empire said, "Don't be like this guy. Enjoy your olives as well." Let's just say that the approaches were inventive. At times, it was brief, finished well, and continued with the performance. In other cases, particularly if the individual had made headlines, it was too detailed. According to the Romans, justice ought to be effective, dramatic, and ideally supported by a toga-wearing individual. By now, the audience had become accustomed to it. Children requested better chairs. Shopkeepers sold snacks. Nobody blinked. If anything, the length of it irritated them. Someone would murmur, "Come on, the actual matches are the only reason we are here." That's why this section is so ridiculous. Executions were only filler material for the viewers, similar to advertisements, except that they showed why it's not a good idea to steal soap instead. And that's kind of the purpose, if that makes you uneasy. It was more than simply an arena at the Colosseum. It was an expertly planned display of dominance. The purpose of every moment, even intermission, was to remind the public of those in positions of authority and the consequences of questioning them. Referees call games in modern sports too much bread and were, perhaps 2 goblets full of wine, rendered the final decision in the Roman Colosseum. It's true that justice was crowdsourced in Rome. The loser did not necessarily die right away after a gladiator bout. The crowd had the last say on whether he battled properly or at least flailed with zeal. Would he survive to fight another day, or would his story serve as a warning to future footwork? The thumbs come in. The well-known thumbs down, which means death, is surely familiar to you, except from the storyline surprise. It's unclear to historians which thumb indicated what. According to some accounts, a thumbs up signified execution, like to a sword being drawn. Others claim that giving the thumbs down represented showing clemency or sheathing the sword. Others contend that the motions were more ambiguous hand movements that made. Gladiators wish the Romans had just created scorecards rather than thumb gestures at all. In any case, they weren't bashful and cared about the audience's response. They arrived at the Colosseum prepared to voice their uninvited opinions, cheer and jeer at those who are actually battling for their lives. With fewer stars and more tunics, it was old Yelp. The worst thing that could happen to a boxer is silence if he was dull. The crowd screamed for punishment, pity, or both if he was exciting. To be honest, it was a little unclear, but loud. Favor was courted by certain gladiators. They performed for the audience. They had admirers, real fan bases, really. Some warriors had products, and others were renowned by name. All right. People wore carvings of them, although they weren't official products. The same concept. And it quickly became political if the emperor was there. He had the power to overrule the decision of the audience and demand execution or leniency. He was reading the audience, in any case, like a stand-up comedian, but with fewer jokes and a larger stake. Depending on the emperor, that is. Thus, despite their chaotic appearance, the games were oddly democratic. For the warriors, anyhow. You had a chance if you entertained. The crowd was prepared to cast their votes with their hands, voices, and perhaps their sandwiches if you didn't. because it took more than skill to survive in the Colosseum. It all came down to putting on a nice show and hoping that the public was feeling charitable. The common wild boar is probably not the most intimidating of the animals you would see at the Roman Colosseum, along with lions, tigers, and that one guy with a net. Pigs, however, were more than simply sustenance in ancient Rome. They contributed to the amusement, and not in a cutesy way, like at a petting zoo. Boars in the wild were serious. They were forest-born, hoof-wielding, powerful, tusk-wielding rams. Imagine them as nature's irate bowling balls, but with more force and less pity. Now picture yourself trying to seem heroic in a leather skirt as one of them charges at you in front of a roaring audience. Although gladiators received extensive training, pig strategy was not one of the main topics covered. Hunting animals occasionally involved the use of boars. Venetans were unleashed into the arena for spear-wielding combatants to destroy. At other times, the bow were presented as unexpected visitors in the middle of battle to keep things interesting. A 300-pound pig running across the stage without invitation was the perfect way to spice up a presentation. Records of at least one occasion show an animal so hostile that it nearly raced into the first row, charged through props, and disregarded its handler. It was adored by the Romans. Airborne pork says great public funding better than anything else. And in case you're wondering how this was considered amusing by the Roman populace, the purpose was to be unpredictable. A lion was a magnificent animal. A tiger frightened me. But it was funny, a boar, particularly when it was undervalued. Emperors participated as well. Some organized themed hunts to display their collections of exotic animals, including, especially, ferocious pigs, to demonstrate how well stocked their kingdom was with boldness and bacon. In contrast, the warriors were mostly focused on surviving. To counter a sword, you may practice. A wild boar instead of a human is what you might expect. With tusks that made kneecaps dangerous, it was utter mayhem in pig form, and nobody questioned the crucial question of whether we should be doing this in the great tradition of Roman entertainment. Can we fit another boar into this scene? They wondered. They could, and frequently did, to give you the spoiler. This was no typical expanse of sand for the arena floor. It was surrounded by a maze of pulleys, elevators, cages, and tunnels, crafted with the intention of ruining someone's afternoon. Stage crews were able to bring objects, animals, and even complete sets into the stadium with eerie theatrical timing, thanks to these mechanical wonders. Sweating in the Roman sun, you're a gladiator in the middle of a battle. The floor suddenly opens, revealing a leopard just as you're ready to win. Bonus material alone, not included in the contest. This was no coincidence. Roman event planners enjoyed surprises. It was a genuine career. When you could transform a typical diamond into an obstacle course with hidden lions, why not? In addition to animals, there were occasionally fire pits, chariots, and big wooden structures that were supposed to depict legendary settings like the underworld or a shoddy volcano. It's all intended to keep the audience interested, and the participants were quite perplexed. It transformed theater into complete anarchy and battle into theater. You did more than simply battle your opponent. You battled the objects, the floor, and your mounting sense that someone was laughing heartily backstage. Underneath the stage, groups of slaves and laborers controlled these trapdoors, synchronizing time with the accuracy of a military operation, or, at the very least, a slightly disorganized circus. It was exciting for the fighters, and it taught them humility and ankle awareness, because in the Colosseum, you weren't just up against opponents. You were up against architecture, stage design, and the Roman Empire's deep commitment to surprising people with unpleasant things. If the gods really favored the brave, then they must have also appreciated those who avoided falling through a trap door in the middle of a victory pose. Suddenly, a bear appeared in the wrong scene, or worse, didn't appear at all, leaving two fighters awkwardly circling each other for 20 minutes. Gladiator bouts seem as the most equitable event on the Colosseum program at first appearance. Like in the old UFC, but with finer attire, two well-matched, trained professionals square off in front of a boisterous audience. However, since this is Rome, justice was, of course, optional. Many bouts were rigged more quickly than a politician's re-election campaign, although some bouts were fairly balanced for dramatic tension and crowd investment. An experienced veteran with years of arena experience may be one of the fighters. Also, don't get too tied to the concept of conventional weaponry. The other is a scared novice who had just discovered which end of the blade was the business end. One warrior might occasionally receive a gladius and a shield. The audience liked diversity, and someone in charge of event planning had a knack for mayhem. So it was not because it was tactically sound. These strange combinations had names. Particularly well-liked was the Cesar versus the Retiarius Trident Man. One had conventional clothes, armor, and a large helmet. The other depended on ducking for dear life, carried a glorified fish fork, and wore nearly nothing. Speedy McBear's feet were better able to escape getting flattened than it was a battle of equals. What causes the discrepancies? Rome enjoyed contrast for that reason. It was dull to see two warriors with the same weapons. But contrast a wiry, almost nude rope flinger with a large, armored tank. That's amusement. Additionally, the fight can be skewed in favor of one gladiator if he had a sponsor to to satisfy or a developing fan following. He did it to seem even more awesome. When he won, not to prove himself. Gladiators were more than just warriors. They were walking brand names and investments. The empire leaned in if someone had a spectacular winning run or a unique combat technique. Fans purchased figurines. Youngsters performed their triumphs. Although it wasn't formally recognized, merchandise existed. In order to preserve the mythology, they were occasionally given an easy win. The warrior who lost. He was unfortunate or forgettable, or perhaps both, because equilibrium was a myth in the Colosseum. The crowd wasn't there to watch sportsmanship. They arrived to witness someone outmatched and, ideally, outwitted. And that was quite a tale if that individual prevailed in any manner. Don't assume that the Roman Colosseum was only about sand and swords. Additionally, it was about spin knot, the type that occurs when someone is struck too severely and tumbles in a spectacular spiral. No politics was involved. The Colosseum served as more than just a venue for public entertainment. It was a public relations machine designed to remind everyone of the particular person in command. Every occasion, game, and oops we released to Tiger situation contributed to the well-planned imperial message. Do as you are told. Executions served as more than simply penalties. They were declarations. People who were traitors, rebels, or just irritated influential senators were publicly and theatrically executed, sometimes with staging and narrative. You end up in a scroll one day with a negative view. The next day, you are participating in a myth reenactment as fallen hero number 2, something you did not request to do. And the emperor was staring, not only observing. Naturally, he was seated in the ideal spot dead center, with lots of shade and near enough to the action to nod respectfully when someone was artfully beheaded. As much as the battles, the crowd watched him. His responses were important. He wasn't simply making a gesture as he offered a thumbs up. It had a headline. The games were employed by certain emperors to gain favor. Remember, bread and circuses. People won't see the empire's budget collapsing if you keep them fed and occupied. Others intimidated others with it. A surprise lion here, a public execution there all of them are quite inspiring. And you may even be utilized politically if you were fortunate enough to be a well-liked gladiator. You were evidence of Rome's power if you fought properly. You were suddenly a liability because you refused to die a dignified death. At times, political narratives were used to orchestrate entire events, commemorating a military triumph. Fantastic. Let's act it out. In the arena, with real casualties and extras, welcoming a dignitary from abroad. Let's show them how much fun tigers can be. A man in armor jumping over a hippo is the ultimate way to impress a visiting official. Indeed, the most violent news conference in Rome took place at the Colosseum. The empire's overarching message approach was reflected in each spectacular fall and sand splash. Rome is powerful. Rome is magnificent. Rome is undoubtedly observing, with all the political connotations, armed pigs, trapdoors, and mismatches. How long did the Colosseum remain open? Easy. Rome had a spectacle addiction. These weren't only performances. They served as social glue, political instruments, and cultural events, and sometimes legally dubious treatment for a society in dire need of pastimes. The empire was vast, intricate, and often, and occasionally, literally, on fire. However, when a gladiator bout was held for the populace, things felt stable. All of a sudden, the formula was successful. Give a bored, overburdened citizen a seat in the Colosseum, a snack, and a front row seat to someone wrestle a panther in a wig instead of letting them gripe about grain shortages. Life wasn't that horrible all of a sudden. Empire building 101. Is that? Dazzle, distract, repeat. Emperors also adored it. After tax increases, do you want to gain favor? Organize an event for a week. Unintentionally offended the Senate. Let loose some tigers and burning chariots. Attempted to instill fear in a general, and had his adversary play the protagonist in a reenacted story without informing him that it was a metaphor. The Colosseum was the first social media feed with continuous drama, updates, and a location where people launched their careers, eliminated their adversaries, and formed their public personas with a single thumb motion. However, there was no comments section only, thunderous applause, or total quiet, which in Rome was essentially a vote against. However, even the biggest empires eventually become weary. The audience grew less awed, the spectacles got less spectacular, and importing the animals became more difficult. Even the Colosseums seemed like yesterday's news by the time Rome started to fall apart, just as sand and stone fade with time. So do attention spans. The legacy persisted. Nevertheless, we still think of the Colosseum as a symbol of how far society would go for a good performance, rather than as a place to play sports. It was unfair. It wasn't nice. However, it was a memorable experience because you're not going for subtlety. When you're building a stage for 50,000 people and filling it with iron, fire, and politics, your goal is to make history. Consider yourself a farmer in prehistoric Ireland. The winds are changing on this April 30th as you gaze across the undulating hills. You think, yep, time to light something on fire again. Welcome to Beltane, the ancient Celtic fire festival that was more than simply a celebration of the arrival of summer. It was about getting through it. Your forebears were busy piling wood and herding cows between two raging bonfires, whereas modern people would crack a bottle of sunscreen and gripe about the heat. Why? Due to their belief that the smoke might protect, cleanse, and maybe even awe the local spirits. Fire was more than simply a useful tool in this planet. It acted as a mediator between worlds and was a living force. It wasn't a casual lighting job. It was holy. The flames were controlled by the community's spiritual MVPs, the Druids. They would chant, make theatrical gestures, and ultimately bring forth the need fire, a central bonfire from which all of the local family flames were recited. Imagine it as a spiritual reset button, only with a lot more sparks and no user guides. Villagers would bring their live stag, real cows, and sheep between the twin blazes while the fires roared. This may sound a little extreme, but it was insurance against illness and bad luck. Do you want your cattle to continue being productive and healthy? March them through the flames. Do you want to maintain your fertility? Dare yourself to jump over the flames. Mild singing says romance better than anything else. Of course, depending on the year and my level of participation, there was dancing, either nude or clothed. While lone dancers sought to evoke some divine matchmaking from above, couples may jump the flames together to cement their love. Beltane was not just a celebration. It was a flaming handshake between mortals and the other realm, a ceremony of seasonal transition. The blessing of flame was then dispersed over the area when the fires subsided and the embers were left in the fields. Let's now depart from the wet hills of Celtic regions and enter the dry, sun-drenched interior of ancient Persia. Here, you couldn't play about with fire and hope your sheep remained healthy. It was a heavenly energy that needed to be nourished, honored, and most definitely not sneezed on. Greetings from Zoroastrianism, one of the oldest monotheistic faiths. In the world where fire is not only revered, but also considered to be truth. Indeed, they dubbed it Atar, a living representation of Asher, the universe's divine order. Fire was therefore more than simply a useful kitchen visitor. It was a luminous symbol of cosmic equilibrium. No pressure, then. The fire temple, where priests, known as medicines, cared after everlasting flames that had been blazing for years, or perhaps millennia, served as the focal point of worship. Imagine them as heavenly janitors, dressed in robes and equipped with bundles of sandalwood and eagle feathers for delicate fanning instead of extinguishers. It was believed that this flame needed to be maintained undisturbed, unbroken, and unpolluted, letting it escape. That was essentially a cosmic transgression, a legendary act of heavenly oopsie. Static worship was not the only use for these fire rites. Whole towns would burn bonfires in public squares to commemorate creation, rebirth, and the constant struggle between light and darkness during significant festivals like Sad and Chashan Basuri. Sparks weren't only symbolic in these times. People would jump over the fires while saying things like, "Give me your red color. Take away my sickly pallor," which, let's face it, is essentially the ancient Persian equivalent of New Year, New Me. In addition to sending prayers to the gods, the fire also served as a messenger, warding off any ill luck or demons that could have been hiding beneath your carpets. Even funeral rites prevented the deceased from being in direct contact with flames. Why? Since that would contaminate it. Like an everlasting therapist who has seen everything but never speaks, fire has to remain pure, hygienic, and judgment-free. Fire was not something to be subdued in the Persian perspective. It served as a holy thread that bound people to the divine design of the universe. Yes, it's a nice, flickering flame, but it's also a fiery reminder to maintain the proper balance between your soul and your kindling. We now enter ancient Greece, where fire festivals were more than simply religious rites. They were intense, sporting contests, because the Greeks did more than simply pray when they paid homage to the gods. They ran with fire. The flagship event was the Lampodromia, or torch race. Imagine runners passing blazing torches across Athens in a religious relay, like flaming batons, and speed wasn't the only objective. The purpose was to maintain the flame. You are disqualified if you let your torch go out or drop it. Well done. You have let the gods and your city down. The gods of wisdom and fire were honored with these races. Prometheus, the disobedient giant who famously took fire from Olympus and gave it to humanity, and Histus, the forge god. Zeus gave him an eternal liver-pecking punishment for his daring action, which is equivalent to a light slap on the wrist in Greek mythology. It was more than simply a sporting event. Ritual theater was what it was. Runners represented the perseverance of heavenly wisdom transmitted to mankind by maintaining the flame. Being in possession of the fire was insufficient. In Hephaestus' workshop, you had to demonstrate that you could carry it without fumbling like a butter-fingered apprentice. This was no ordinary jog through the olive orchards either. Temples, columns, and bewildered cattle were all shadowed by the fiery torches that were the only source of light during the frequently nighttime races. It was a deliberate, visual impression. You had best make it seem spectacular, since the gods were looking. Deeper metaphorical levels were also present. The gift of fire from Prometheus was more than just cooking fuel or warmth. It stood for intelligence, change, and disobedience. The Greeks were not only reenacting a story when they honored him with torch races. In a subtle way, they were reminding themselves of their own cunning rebellion and quest for civilization. Even if the price was magnificent. Since, this being Greece, the winners were given a crown, a little statue, or perhaps even a jug of olive oil. Glory, and perhaps a little reprieve from enraged gods destroying your crops, were the true rewards. Though, therefore, keep in mind that the modern Olympic torch relay is more than simply a sporting custom the next time you witness one. Greek adoration of stolen fire, cosmic revolt, and the age-old skill of sprinting really quickly without burning your eyebrows off are all faintly echoed in it. We now move eastward from Greek torch relays to ancient India, where the gods did not steal fire. The deity was the one. Introducing Agni, the Hindu fire deity, who served as a cosmic postman in addition to being a god of warmth and light. His job is to reliably transport gifts from the earth to the heavens by fire. No customer service line, no misplaced shipments. Ag served as a conduit between people and the gods in the ancient Indian religious rites, known as Vik rituals. Fire was necessary for any prayer to have any merit. Not just any fire, either. It needed to be properly lighted and fed ghee and clarified butter. In essence, the sacred liquid that is used in all rituals and is accompanied by mantras. They were known as yans. Priests dedicated their entire lives to perfecting them because they were so significant. Imagine spiritual pyromania with fewer insurance claims and a lot more incense. A sacred fire pit known as a haven kund was built during a normal yena, frequently in elaborate geometric designs in harmony with the powers of heaven. Without a matchstick in sight, the fire had to be enticed into life by friction or a divine chance. Ag came to life once it was ignited. You were not only seeing a fire, you were looking a deity in the eye. However, this was not an isolated incident. Everlasting flames burned in the most pious homes. Generation after generation carried on the flames that never died out. In addition to being inconvenient, a fire's death was a spiritual emergency. Some even thought it may upset the cosmic equilibrium. Consider yourself the one who unintentionally poured water on a divine flame. Well, it doesn't really cover it. This Vedic heritage was then carried into seasonal festivities that marked agricultural changes with bonfires, singing, and offerings via fire festivals like Lori and Makai. Purification, dancing in sparkles, ecstasy enveloped in smoke. Additionally, fire was intimate, alive, and highly revered here, in contrast to certain cultures where it was kept at arm's length. Agi was not a blaze to be feared. As a witness to every pledge, every birth, and every departing soul, he was revered like an ancestor. If fire was a supernatural messenger in ancient India, it was God himself, the breath of the sun. In ancient Egypt, there was more than a glimmer of fire here. Ra, the sun deity who rode around the sky on a flaming solar bark, was the embodiment of cosmic authority. And with just radiant celestial fire, he battled a chaos serpent in the underworld every night. Ra, don't put any pressure on yourself. Let's focus on human rituals, nevertheless. Because the Egyptians also celebrated with flame when Ra managed the solar cycle. They didn't utilize fire to stay warm. It represented regeneration, protection, and cleansing. The darkest parts of temples were oriented to catch the early sun, giving the impression that the gods themselves were turning on the lights. The Feast of Opet, also known as the Weep, Rennet Festival, was the most well-known fire ceremony that celebrated the start of a new year. It wasn't your typical countdown with fireworks, priests, incense, gifts, and most importantly ceremonial torches carried in processions were all part of the multi-day show. These weren't only display pieces. Ra's healing force was symbolized by the fire, which fought off disease and darkness as it returned to Earth. It was similar to using sacred pyrotechnics for spiritual pest control. Fire was an essential but carefully controlled part of even Inari activities. For them, that was a bit too definitive. However, at burial rites, they burnt sacred oils and incense. It was thought that the soul's essence was carried upward by the smoke rising from the offerings, facilitating its safe passage into the afterlife. Even better if the gods were pleased by the aroma. In temples, especially those devoted to Ra, or his fiery daughter, Sekhmet, a lion-headed deity you certainly didn't want to annoy. Priests also kept perpetual flames burning. To placate her destructive propensity, she performed fire rituals throughout her festivals. Indeed, because Egyptian, gods cherished symbolism and moderately dramatic drama. These occasionally used beardy crimson to resemble blood. Egypt's fire was not a riot. There was a script for each spark. We now descend into ancient Mesoamerica's highlands and forests, where fire was more than simply a symbol of life. It was the universe's engine, and it took a little more than candles and good vibes to keep that engine operating. Fire was a revered element that controlled time, agriculture, and even human destiny among the Aztecs, Mer, and Zapotecs. However, they didn't play around with simple celebrations. Their fire resets were conjugal. Every 52 years, after the Aztec calendar has finished its holy cycle, there's a fresh fire ritual, a cosmic version of Y2K, but with fewer IT experts and greater stakes. Every home fire was put out nationwide as the terrible date drew near. The cities were dark. People's possessions were ruined. They prayed, fasted, and essentially believed that the world may end. Priests then climbed a holy mountaintop and offered a heart sacrifice at midnight. The fire wasn't deemed to have rekindled until the heart had been burnt, and the fresh flame had ignited inside the chest cavity. Every home fire throughout the empire would be reignited by this one miraculous spark. Fire represented cosmic confirmation, continuance, and regeneration. The sun might not rise again if the fire didn't ignite. There is no pressure. Fire was also essential to royal rites and temple dedications in Maya society. Fire roused newly constructed temples. To activate the building, they would actually burn offerings in the center chamber, as though calling in heavenly occupants. Additionally, if you were a king, you had to have fire rites to demonstrate your authority, which included burning incense and occasionally performing ceremonial bloodletting. The Zapotecs were equally dedicated. In celebration of their fire deity, Koyo, who was strongly associated with lightning and storms. There were dances, bonfires, and sometimes the spectacular burning of symbolic effigies, kind of heavenly, piñata with a volatile personality. Fire was both a request and a means of communication with the gods in each of these societies. It needed to be fed because it was hungry, not with copal, resin, or logs alone, but with sacrifice. Talked, not simply rose. Let's now set sail toward the huge Pacific, whose islands resemble flaming stepping stones. Fire was more than simply a requirement for the Polynesians of antiquity. It was a tale of Genesis, a celestial legacy inherited from mountain-dwelling gods. The goddess Pel, the fierce spirit of volcanoes, is at the center of many Polynesian fire beliefs. She is especially adored in Hawaiian mythology. She wasn't a serene deity who cared for your cooking pot. She was a fiery natural force that used her lava to form islands before destroying them in a fit of wrath. In this society, respecting fire was a must. It was a matter of survival. According to legend, Pel resided in the Halema Amau crater, at the top of Kilauea, one of the world's most active volcanoes. It was not a natural disaster when it erupted. She expressed herself in a pallid manner. The ground was reshaped in accordance with her desire, and lava flows were perceived as her flaming footprints. Near craters, people placed offerings, including food, flowers, chants, and occasionally even hair or nails. Because it pays to be on the good side of a deity who is actually changing the topography. Polinia's fire celebrations had numerous forms, but the Sa-Afi, or fire knife dance, was one of the most captivating. Still gave performances in Tonga and Samoa. The dance, which was once a component of warrior ceremonies, involves leaping, flipping, and generally defying common reason while whirling flaming blades. It was a spiritual presentation, not only a show. The flaming knife was viewed as a dance with ancient power, an extension of inner strength. Polynesians employed fire in their daily lives to illuminate pathways during ceremonies, cook in yu-mu, earth ovens, and interact with the spirit world. The earthly and the divine, the visible and the invisible, were connected by fire. Sacred torches and chants guided the spirit toward ancestral lands beyond the sea as part of the funeral rites. According to some islanders, the flickering of torches or the sparkle of fireflies were signs that ancestor spirits were traveling on fire. Ignoring or misusing fire was a certain way to upset both ghosts and gods. You would think that the icy regions of ancient Scandinavia would be too damp and chilly for ceremonies using fire. The Norse, on the other hand, had a very strong bond with fire. Fire was more than just a source of warmth in a place with freezing fjords and never-ending winters. It signified spiritual and bodily survival. The cosmic dualism of fire and ice lies at the core of Norse mythology. The conflict between Niflheim, the country of cold, and Muslim, the land of fire, gave rise to the world itself. Sparks practically flew as the two collided in Ginnungagap's primeval emptiness. Hymir was the first creature to emerge from the turmoil, followed by the gods. Fire was therefore not just necessary. It had the ability to both create and destroy. Serta, a Muslim fire giant that was prophesied to ride forth with a fiery sword in hand during Ragnarok. The Norse apocalypse was the most dreaded fire figure in Norse mythology. Burning the globe to ash was his goal. Fire was not taken lightly. As you can see, fire festivals served as a more tangible symbol of seasonal transitions, particularly the end of winter and the coming of spring. Fire played a central role in festivities such as Ule, which eventually became part of Christmas. Days passed while great logs burnt. High Ule log, which stands for the sun's rebirth. Your fortunes for the upcoming year will improve the longer it burnt. In addition to being comfortable, starting the Ule fire was cosmic insurance. During midsummer festivities, when the light was at its brightest and spirits were free to wander, bonfires were also lighted, would provide protection fertility, and, perhaps, even the chance to win over your sweetheart. And fire had the last say when it came to death. Although cremation was frequent, and fire was thought to release the spirit to Valhalla or folk Vangungar, the eternal regions of warriors and the chosen Viking funerals weren't all longboats and slow-motion archery. The fire honors, elevates, and purifies. It was a combination of dramatic flair, metamorphosis, and goodbye. In the ancient world, fire was not only a source of life, but also a source of condemnation. It may burn your heritage or heat your house. Fire became the ultimate test, a means of cosmic reckoning, spiritual cleansing, and divine justice for many societies. There were also no appeals, in contrast to contemporary courts. Fire was a witness as well as a deity in ancient India. Sita, the hero, Rama's wife, was physically put to the test by fire in the epic Ramayana. She demonstrated her innocence by walking through flames after being abducted and saved. Agi, the fire, came out with a heavenly nod rather than a guilty conviction. Yes, it was a fiery jumble of gender norms, but it also demonstrated how fire was seen as the ultimate judge of reality. Similar concepts spread through trial by ordeal in medieval and ancient Europe. Tests based on fire, such as stepping across flaming coals or holding a red-hot iron, were occasionally administered to suspected criminals, witches, or unlucky people. They were innocent if their wounds healed without infection. If not, you most likely didn't want to attend the final discussions. These trials demonstrated the persistent idea that fire might reveal divine intent, even if they weren't particularly spiritually uplifting. The idea of Chinvat Bridge, the portal to the hereafter, was one of the first ideas of fire as judgment in Zoroastrianism. Souls would cross a razor-thin bridge over a river of molten metal once they died. It would be as soft as warm milk to those who had led a moral life. Let's just say that the evildoers learned that heavenly metal isn't cold. It was viewed as a recurring struggle even by the Aztecs, who worshipped fire with scrupulous devotion. The world may perish if their new fire ritual didn't work. Originally a gift from the gods, fire may also end up being their preferred means of erasing the cosmos. It kept people modest and perhaps a bit combustible. In each of these customs, fire turned into a mirror. It showed what you brought to it: truth, shame, dedication, or fear. Fire was the last test of the soul, whether in a terrible trial or in holy rites. Tax payment was more than just a financial obligation in ancient Egypt. It was essentially a spiritual duty. The pharaoh was not your typical official. He served as the heavenly go-between for the gods and people. Therefore, it wasn't considered exploitation when he requested tribute. It was thought to preserve cosmic equilibrium. Matt, the universe's divine order. There is no better way to maintain perspective than to be taxed by a deity. Early Egyptian civilization did not actually have money as we know it now. How, therefore, did the pharaoh replenish his royal wealth? Grain, a ton of grain. Fields were guaranteed by the Nile's yearly flooding. And scribes would show up with clipboards, or rather, papyrus scrolls, to calculate your precise debt after harvest. They made use of sticks, rope, and a calculator-like device out of exasperation. You may owe the state 3 bags if your farm generated 10. It's not an option to not pay. Yes, you might pay in work, but you may also lose your property, your animals, or find yourself inexplicably volunteered for a state labor project. Neither slaves nor aliens constructed the imposing pyramids of Giza. Taxpayers contributed to their construction. You may be drafted to labor on public projects like as transporting limestone, excavating irrigation canals, or building the newest shrine to Horus. If you didn't have enough food or merchandise, well done, the National Infrastructure Initiative in Egypt now includes you. Scribes, the keen-eyed record keepers with a monopoly on literacy, scrupulously documented the whole system. They kept track of everything, including whether your donkey was taxed and how much wheat you owed. Yes, taxes might be imposed on animals as well. It's likely that the state wanted a share of it if it moved and had worth. Although Egypt's tax system was organized, effective, and harshly enforced when necessary, it was also adaptable. Tax collectors may lower quotas during years of hunger or flooding, not always out of altruism, but sometimes because deceased farmers do not pay taxes. The Romans were the first to convert physiological processes into taxable assets. Taxation was both a bureaucratic craft and a source of fabled complaints in the vast empire of marble forums and gladiator bouts. Nothing indicates efficient governance like taxing people to urinate. So you might be charged for land, slaves, doors, and yes, urine. Let's begin with the notorious vectal uriny, often known as the urine tax. Human pee was gathered from public urinals and fullers' workshops, and it was then no joke used as a source of ammonia to bleach clothes and tan leather. Emperor Vespasian took the appropriate action when he discovered that this physiological residue had chemical value. The collectors were charged by him. Money doesn't stink, as the saying goes. When his son Titus questioned the morality of such a tax, pecunia non lit was created. Vespasian inquired whether it smelled and gave him a penny. It didn't. You're right. However, that is only the beginning of imperialism. To encourage modest design, Rome levied fees on windows. A portion of your wealth might be deducted by inheritance taxes, and slave ownership had its own tariff. Although it only applied to free citizens, there was also a sales tax. Because, congrats, if you were slaves, you were already considered taxable property in some way. Publicani, as tax collectors were known, were, to put it mildly, losing popularity contests. These intermediaries pinched citizens for as much as they could in order to make a profit after paying the state in advance for the authority to collect taxes. They were the archaic counterpart of a hedge fund-run private collection agency. Additionally, troops may arrive to persuade you if you refuse to pay. Notwithstanding this, Roman taxes financed a number of remarkable constructions, including roads, temples, aqueducts, and military victories that extended the empire from Britain to Syria. Depending on your point of view, you may say that Roman tax both fueled and destroyed civilization. Indeed, there were tax revolts in the center of Mesoamerica. The Aztec Empire operated one of the most complex and organized tribute systems the world has ever seen. Provinces moaned under the weight of tribute, and several rebellions began with a question: how much? And no, neither gold nor coins served as its foundation. Jaguar pelts, cocoa beans, and feathers, so exquisite they made European rulers appear underdressed, propelled it. In contrast to contemporary taxation, Aztec tribute taxation functioned as a massive imperial wish list. Your consent was not required by the emperor. He required frequent, ideally excuse-free delivery of the greatest items in your area. Each city-state or altar flower that came under Aztec rule had to provide tribute, which was painstakingly documented by scribes known as calpixa. These men were carrying intricate codices that showed the amount owing. Pictures, not numbers. Bundles of obsidian, piles of labyrinth, stacks of cotton, and yes, bags of cocoa beans. Consider it to be a visual bill from hell. Cocoa beans were particularly important as money as well as food and drink. A few may purchase a coat, a tamale, or a ticket to the local human sacrifice. Because they were so valuable, counterfeiters attempted to fill them with dirt and hollow them out. Yes, it was bold, but it was also a felony that carried a death sentence. Tenochtitlan's IRS did not play around. The delectable turkey honey, the ornamental jade gold dust, or the utterly inconvenient enormous logs transported from woods kilometers distant might all be used as tribute goods. Regular deliveries of embroidered warrior costumes, complete with combat-ready footwear, were required from one province. Another created headdresses for both gods and aristocrats using feathers from exotic birds. Consider explaining to your town why you have to pay taxes on 2 jaguar pelts and 30 live parrots. Apologies, children. It's another jaguar chasing day. Violent retaliation might follow non-payment of tribute. Aztec tax collectors were not timid, and military reminders were frequently sent to areas that were rebelling. Rather than being a civic obligation, compliance was a question of survival. The tribute system maintained the empire's prosperity in spite of the onerous penalties. Tenochtitlan, the capital, was a metropolis of shimmering temples, floating gardens, and marketplaces brimming with merchandise, most of which was financed by the backs of subordinate villages. Taxation in ancient China was mostly a matter of sheer magnitude rather than extravagant penalties or strange items. With an empire that appeared to last forever and a population in the tens of millions, China created a bureaucratic tax system so extensive and accurate that it would make Roman senators cry into their wine. First, let's talk about labor and rice. Peasants were the backbone of the economy under the Han Dynasty, and they paid taxes in 3 main ways: corv, labor, fabric, and grain. The granaries of the empire were full with the grain. The fabric was given to state representatives, and the labor well, that meant spending weeks or months away from home repairing roads, canals, or the odd, huge wall. Imagine tax season with bricks being hauled through the GOI in place of papers. The taxes changed along with the empire. The 2-tax system was developed during the Tang Dynasty with the intention of making things simpler. Payments were due twice a year, in the summer and the fall, and were determined by your land holdings and the number of people who were consuming your rice. It was fair in theory. In reality, tax collectors' definition of fair was ambiguous. Then the silent empire builder, the salt tax, arrived. The government imposed a high tax on salt, a daily requirement, rather than taxing everyone equally. In a period before refrigerators, everyone needed it. Thus, the state became extremely wealthy. For centuries, armies, palaces, and the pensions of officials were financed by salt money. The claim that salt underwrote dynasties is not hyperbole. However, taxes were used for more than just financing. It has to do with control. Land surveys and household registers, as well as conducting censuses, were essentially works of art, determining the precise amount of rice you produced, the number of sons you had, and whether you were concealing a second ox behind the barn. It wasn't all harmony and order, of course. One of the main reasons for peasant uprisings, such as the Yellow Turban Rebellion that erupted in the late Han era, was excessive taxation. Bad things usually happen when farmers are famished and still required to provide 30% of their rice. Ancient Mesopotamians were developing the fine art of taxing with clay tablets, reed styluses, and zero tolerance for inventive deductions long before contemporary accountants started requesting your W-2. The Sumerians, Babylonians, and Assyrians established the world's first tax system and the earliest known tax. Grievances in the region between the Tigris and Euphrates. Scribes engraved tax records onto soft clay rather than paper forms. Thousands of these cuneiform tablets recorded everything from animal counts to grain payments. Try waiting for a guy scribbling symbols into dirt to log your grain levy if you think your local tax office is sluggish. Barley, the staple tax. Farmers gave the temple or palace a share of their crop in early city-states like Uruk and Lagash. Furthermore, the temples served as more than just places of worship. They had stew-rooms, tax officers, and unexpectedly strict clerics, and were full-fledged economic centers. But it wasn't just grain. The people of Mesopotamia levied taxes on traders, commodities, craftsmen's workshops, and fishermen's catch. Donkeys weren't safe either. Congratulations if you have a cart or a donkey that worked. You were now a tiny transport company that was subject to taxes. Taxation was further organized by Hammurabi, the Babylonian monarch. He established sanctions for tax evasion, overcharging authorities, and systemic deception in his renowned legal code, which is among the oldest in the world. Sometimes the penalty went beyond a simple fine. Death or dismemberment was the choice. Therefore, keep in mind that at least your current tax form does not carry the risk of amputation if you ever feel that it is harsh. The incorporation of taxes into public works was one distinctive aspect of Mesopotamian taxation. In order to assist construct city walls, ziggurats, and canals, citizens may pay taxes in labor, bricks, or money. The state may take your time, or your children's time if you were unable to pay in things. Loaning your child to the temple for a season is the epitome of budgetary responsibility. However, the Mesopotamian tax system was incredibly effective for its day. It supported troops, funded irrigation systems, and assisted with the management of large towns. To put it another way, it prevented the entire business from collapsing like a mud brick in the sun. Taxes in ancient Greece were more about clumsily passing the bill around than they were about maintaining governmental order. Many Greek city-states, particularly Athens, depended on a combination of social pressure, civic pride, and well-hidden tax-dodging tactics. In contrast to centralized empires like Egypt or China. Let's begin with the fundamentals. It was uncommon to tax citizens directly. Income tax was not paid by Athenians as it is today. Rather, they were supposed to support the state by participating in liturgies. Hey, rich guy, it's your turn to pay for a play, a worship, or a festival. These weren't quite taxes, but imagine being asked to dinner and refusing. Aliens who lived and worked in Athens, including foreigners and medical professionals, did pay taxes. In exchange for the luxury of not being a full citizen, they had to pay a monthly protection charge. Basically, I'm grateful that you live here. Cough it up now. Another treasure trove was trade. The busy port of Piraeus handled imports and exports, and Athens made sure to collect its share of docking fees. Ideas cannot be taxed, but wine, olive oil, and ceramics can. Philosophers, who naturally had views on taxes as well, openly expressed such views. According to Plato, leaders need to lead humble lives and work for the government rather than for its benefit. Ever the realist, Aristotle believed that taxes were an essential component of government, but he also pointed out that high taxes may incite insurrection. At the same time, the typical Athenians just wanted the tax collectors to avoid their grape harvest. This leads us to the story's true antagonists, tax farmers. Greek governments auctioned off the authority to collect taxes rather than doing so themselves. After paying the state in advance, the highest bidder would go out and recover the money, plus a lot more. At a conference, these tax farmers were as well liked as damped tunics. The system functioned rather well in spite of the pandemonium. Roads, battles, temples, and democracy itself were all financed by taxes. However, animosity persisted, particularly among the impoverished, and tax evasion occasionally resulted in exile, legal action, or public indignation. Greetings from the Inca Empire, where taxes were paid without cash or even cocoa beans. You used your spine, feet, and hands to pay. Across what is now Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Chile, the Incas established one of the most remarkable civilizations in the Americas. They accomplished this without the use of written language, markets, or coinage. How did they finance it all, then? Utilizing the mitar, a labor-only tax system. There was no hint of the mitar. State service was required. Each able-bodied male citizen owed the empire a certain number of days annually, which were often used for transporting stones for temples and fortifications, farming state land, mining, silver, or constructing highways. Consider the Inca tax form to be a calendar rather than a bill. The efficiency of the meter system was its greatest asset. The empire distributed work across thousands of tiny towns, known as Alice, rather than consolidating everything in one location. When called upon, Ichu sent its laborers, and the empire reciprocated by giving them access to community storehouses, food, and equipment. You persevered and managed to survive. Do you require a bridge to cross a mountain gorge? The meter supplied. Cities like Cusco and Machu Picchu must be connected by hundreds of kilometers of paved roadways. Mita, do you want a huge stone temple that is as heavy as a bus? Indeed, that as well. However, the taxes went beyond muscle. Additionally, it was required of citizens to weave fabric for the military and nobility, rear llamas for transportation, and cultivate crops on state-owned grounds. Whole areas that produced textiles, potatoes, or maize specifically for redistribution, for use in times of famine or conflict. The empire kept these commodities in massive warehouses called kolkas that were positioned strategically along highways. The Incors did not employ tax collectors in the conventional sense, in contrast to many other ancient civilizations. Rather, quipus, which are knotted ropes used to tally work and productivity, were kept by local officials. They possessed the most intricate tax abacus in the world, constructed of string, so they didn't need to write. And certainly, opposition existed. Following their arrival, the Spanish exploited and killed the Mita by using them as slave laborers in mining. During the Islamic Golden Age, which lasted from the 8th to the 13th century, the empires of the Middle East, North Africa, and portions of Europe operated some of the most advanced taxing systems the world has seen since Rome. What had once been a system of collective obligation turned into a nightmare. However, Islamic taxation was enshrouded in religious obligation, moral philosophy, and careful accountancy. In contrast to previous forms of raw extraction, zakat, one of the 5 pillars of Islam and the religious tax, was at the center of it all. It was more than simply a gift. It was required. Every capable Muslim was supposed to provide around 2.5% of their income each year to aid the underprivileged, the indebted and needy travelers. It was a tax intended to advance social fairness rather than finance armies or palaces. Imagine it as the original plan for economic redistribution, but with heavenly supervision. Zakat, however, was only the start. There was also the jizya, a poll tax paid by non-Muslims in return for protection and exemption from military duty, and the kharaj, a land tax imposed on non-Muslims who cultivated territories they had acquired. They were established by law, ranked by wealth, and frequently negotiated between kings and towns. As long as they made their payments on time, non-Muslims were allowed to maintain their local traditions and faith. The caliphates created a professional class of scribes and accountants to handle all of this. They issued receipts, monitored markets, and maintained ledgers in Arabic script. The state treasury, also known as the Diwan, had a controlled bureaucracy with defined procedures and trained clerks rather than a disorganized treasure trove. Imagine Excel sheets on parchment paper. The relationship between Islamic taxes and market control was one of its distinctive features. To guarantee reasonable prices, truthful weights, and moral behavior, officials known as maktasibs prowled throughout bazaars. A scale, a severe look, and perhaps a Quranic quotation could be displayed by the maktasib if you attempted to conceal your profits in order to evade zakat. Additionally, there were frequent audits and public accountability, even if corruption was not unknown. It was well known that certain rulers, such as Umar ibn al-Khattab, would go about the streets in disguise to make sure that the people weren't being crushed by their tax loads. In many respects, taxes during the Islamic Golden Age struck a balance between piety and profit. It created an intellectual boom that impacted Europe for generations, while also constructing schools, hospitals, and libraries. In medieval Europe, paying taxes was more about surviving feudal extortion with the majority of your limbs intact than it was about fulfilling a civic obligation. The peasants bore the brunt of every penny, chicken, and bale of hay that vanished into the tax cart, notwithstanding the claims of divine authority made by kings and nobility. The tithe was the most infamous medieval tax. 10% of your income had to be given to the church. This was not a charge imposed by the state. This implied that a tenth of your fish, cattle, or crops were sent directly to the nearby monastery. Not willing to pay, you were not only evading taxes, you ran the risk of going to hell forever. When a tax is supported by the prospect of hellfire, it's difficult to dispute. The feudal dues followed. Your existence as a peasant was essentially a subscription service to your master. You paid for the oven where you made your bread, the mill you used, and the land you cultivated, married. It was a charge. Did you inherit your father's profession? An additional charge. Expect a happy tax collector at your door with his handout and a list of inventive new levies if you had an especially strong crop. Following the Norman invasion, taxes in England grew even more structured and menacing. William the Conqueror's Doomsday Book was a massive inventory of property ownership. Even the number of pigs you had lurking in your backyard. No one was out of its line of sight, and it was effectively a tax sniper's scope. Kings found new means to raise money by the 13th century, particularly for war. Monarchs in France and England started imposing direct income and property taxes. However, anger accompanied consolidated control, and tax collectors were frequently despised more than invading armies, and rebel when the state went too far. In 1381, a cruel poll tax sparked the English peasant uprising, a set price per individual, regardless of income. It was the equivalent in medieval times of charging a farmer and a lord the same price and hoping that no one would notice. They saw the spoiler. Medieval Europe's tax system was a tightrope walk, just enough to finance crusades, castles, and cathedrals, but not enough to cause fire and pitchforks. Therefore, ancient taxes were not just based on economics. They also included forced labor, rice, urine, and cocoa beans. It was about control, power, and the tenuous bond between the ruled and the rulers. Penny, death was not the end for the Vikings. It was only the start of something new. Life was short, uncertain, and frequently cruel. However, the true journey started with death, and you can wind up in quite different places after death, depending on how you lived, more crucially, how you passed away. Slain warriors gathered at Valhalla, the golden hall of Odin, the most sought-after afterlife, to feast, battle, and get ready for Ragnarok, the end of all. But you had to die in combat to get to Valhalla, ideally when doing a valiant and extremely violent act. The realm of the goddess Freya Folkvanger had first choice over the fallen, if that wasn't on the menu. Her hall is thought to have been just as renowned, but with fewer head injuries. However, not every soul entered the warrior heaven. It was believed that anyone who passed away from illness, old age, or a lack of flair would wander to hell, the dark world governed by the goddess of the same name. Hell was a more restrained afterlife, maybe with fewer drinking horns and combat songs, rather than a punishment as we understand it now. It should come as no surprise that Viking funeral rituals were well-planned performances that included elements of an homage, a soul-guiding system, and a flex for the living, given their intricate spiritual map. Respect, money, and social standing were demonstrated by a well-run burial. A careless one. That was a surefire way to end up haunted, unlucky, or worse, a disgraced soul roaming aimlessly. Closure was not the goal of these funerals. They aimed to demonstrate that the departed mattered in both life and death, and to provide a safe transition to the afterlife. Offerings of food, weaponry, and personal items to prepare the deceased for their journey may be made at even the most modest burial. Furthermore, the Norse did not use subtlety for the elite. Chieftains, warriors, and aristocrats were frequently given spectacular farewells that included burial mounds, ships, fires, animal sacrifices, and whole rituals carried out with terrifying accuracy. Not only was the deceased to be remembered. But their legacy had to be ingrained in the sagas and in people's minds. Because to be remembered was to live on in Viking culture. The funeral wasn't the last part of the story. It was the afterlife's first page. The deceased weren't just thrown in a pit and forgotten in Viking culture. Care, purpose, and a dash of dramatic flair went into their preparation. If dying was a journey, then the departed too needed to be packed and clothed like a traveler. After someone died, their body was cleaned, combed, and clothed in their best attire. This has nothing to do with vanity. It served as a metaphor. Keeping oneself clean demonstrated respect, and wearing elegant clothing ensured the departed passed on with dignity. A fur-trimmed cloak may be draped over a chieftain dressed in a sumptuous woolen tunic, and embroidered clothing embellished with beads and brooches might be worn by a shield maiden. Jewelry wasn't only decorative, it was spiritual baggage. Weapons were necessary. A warrior's shield and sword, axe, or spear may be buried with him. They weren't props for a ceremony. For the hereafter, they were real tools. After all, you would want your favorite blade at your side if you were going to fight all day in Valhalla. Even ordinary people were occasionally interred with knives or other basic implements, indicating that practicality was just as important as prestige. Grave items were also presented to the deceased. Combs, dice, cooking pans, drinking horns, and occasionally food and mead. They seem to have packed a few food and some entertainment for a lengthy journey. These items had emotional, religious, and utilitarian functions. They were occasionally purposefully shattered before being buried, which would have allowed the item's soul to be used in the afterlife. Social status was important. The more elaborate the preparation, the wealthier or more significant the individual. Although they were uncommon and were only performed for high-ranking persons, there are instances of slaves or servants being sacrificed to join their owners. Yes, it was cruel, but according to Viking mythology, going with your master into the afterlife was an honor. After the corpse was ready, it was left out for a while so that the community may grieve, think, and say farewell. Funerary rites would also start to take shape at this point. Ritualized storytelling, chants, and prayers are used to preserve the heritage of the deceased. Preparing the dead wasn't a somber undertaking for the Vikings. It was an act of cosmic duty, love, and respect. They were doing more than simply adorning a body. They were preparing a soul for the afterlife. Most people see a burning ship bringing a warrior to Valhalla as it drifts toward the horizon at Viking funerals. The image is well ingrained in popular culture. Dramatic, cinematic, and slightly unrealistic. However, how accurate was it? The brief response is a combination of artistic license and truth. The Vikings had a strong bond with ships. These weren't merely ways to get about. Prestige and life itself. For mariners, soldiers, and nobility, being buried aboard a ship, or even with a portion of one, was the ultimate goodbye. It symbolized a return to the gods, the sea, or the epic voyage that lay ahead. However, the majority of Viking burial ships were not burned and sent out to sea, despite what is often believed. That picture most likely combines romantic paintings from the 19th century with later medieval stories. Full ship funerals were really uncommon and costly. When they did occur, the ship was often positioned on land. The grave goods and body were piled within, and the entire building was either burned in place or buried behind a mound. One of the most notable instances is the Oserberg burial, discovered in Norway. On the midst of linens, sledges, and animal sacrifices, it held two exquisitely carved ladies on a ship. Only soil and heritage, no fire. As a further illustration, the Gisterd burial contained the chieftain's remains, together with his equipment, weapons, and even horses that had been sacrificed. Once more, only dignity and craftsmanship, no fire or water. However, there were also cremation graves that featured boats or their symbolic equivalents. In certain locations, smaller boats or boat-shaped outlines constructed of stones were used in cremation rites, with a P erected immediately on the ship. Even though they were logistically straightforward, these events were magnificent. It takes a lot of wood, room, and steely nerves to burn a whole yacht. It was more than a show. Fire. According to Viking mythology, fire sent smoke upward to the gods, purifying the soul. In Norse mythology, it also stopped the dead from reincarnating as restless spirits, which was a very real worry. Viking funerals were more than simply somber events. It was an investment in the next life. Rather, grave items were put upon them. This type of spiritual starting kit is intended to guarantee survival, comfort, and prestige in the hereafter. Let's begin with the fundamentals. Tools, swords, and personal possessions were found in nearly every Viking grave, from the humble farmer to the mighty Jarl. A man's bow, axe, or sword may be buried with him. A lady may possess cooking pots, brooches, weaving equipment, or keys. These were not objects of symbolic meaning. It was thought that the soul employed them in the region to which they were linked after death. Nobody wanted to arrive unarmed or without the necessary household supplies, whether it was Valhalla or hell. Richer people were given more ornate farewells. Drinking horns, board games, exotic silks, musical instruments, and whole wagons or sledges are among the items interred. In the well-known Osberg burial, a lady was buried with dozens of textiles, an elaborate wagon, and 5 well-carved animal heads enough to start a store in the hereafter. However, the usage of animal sacrifice was what made Viking funerals really unique. As prestige, transportation, and power symbols, horses were frequently buried with elites. Multiple horse burials that were meticulously constructed and obviously slaughtered for the occasion have been discovered by archaeologists. There are additional appearances of dogs, hawks, and even oxmen, all of whom are probably selected for certain symbolic or spiritual purposes. The sacrifices included more than just animals in certain instances. It is possible for slaves or servants to be slain and interred with their owner. This was no ordinary act of brutality. It was seen as a sign of devotion or assistance. However, it is unquestionably dismal when viewed from a contemporary standpoint. According to certain tales, such as Ahmad ibn Fadlan's, a slave girl was ritually slain in order to go with a chieftain into the afterlife, thinking that she would serve him even after she died. There was a reason for everything, alive or dead, that was buried. The Vikings thought that, like life itself, the soul required support. The purpose of grave goods was to transport prestige and utility over the cosmic gap in the form of presence, sustenance, and protection. Death was more than simply taking a person from the world in Viking society. It made a mark on it, and that mark was frequently huge, obvious, and miles away. Enter the Hoger, also known as the burial mound in Old Norse, a meticulously constructed hill elevated above the deceased to commemorate their life. Their actions and, let's face it, their social status. These weren't only dirt mounds. The intentional monuments known as Viking burial mounds were constructed with care and effort. Over a timber chamber or sunken ship, a chieftain's mound may be built, stuffed with burial goods, and covered with earth and stone layers. In order to fit in with the surroundings, some were covered in turf. Others left a lasting message to the living, stony and harsh. This is where someone significant is lying. It mattered how big the mound was. Greater legacy, greater mound. These weren't only tombs. They served as outward reminders of a family's riches, influence, and lineage. Mounds were often placed in certain patterns to create ship forms or to match rituals with astronomical occurrences. Vikings were pragmatic, to be sure, but they also had a strong symbolic meaning. These mounds had a social function as well. They developed become hallowed locations, gathering spots for storytelling and recollection. Families may congregate there for feasts, oaths, or seasonal rites. The burial mound evolved into a link between the living and the dead, spanning generations. Additionally, they weren't always satisfied with burying a single individual. Multiple burials might be incorporated into mounds over time, transforming a single burial into a monument to a dynasty. Thus, land was not just inhabited by the living. For centuries, it shaped memory and identity as it was claimed by the deceased. Not every Viking funeral was this elaborate, particularly in areas where soil and space made mound construction impracticable. Common people would be given flat burials or simple stone circles. Even these, however, were thoughtful. Orientation with the sun or stars, cremation remains, and grave goods. It served as a reminder that the Viking mentality looked for purpose even in humble death. To bury or to burn. That was the problem with the Viking funeral, and the response varied according to belief, era, status, and location. The reality is more complex, even though contemporary Viking iconography frequently features spectacular flames and fire-lit farewells. Both inhumation and cremation were practiced by Vikings, frequently concurrently in the same villages. First, let's discuss cremation. Cremation was the most common rite throughout the early Viking era, particularly in Sweden and some areas of Denmark. After being surrounded by grave goods, the body would be put on a funeral pyre and burned. There was more to the fire than just devastation. It was a spiritual release and cleansing. The soul was transported aloft by the rising smoke, maybe to Odin or to a different world. As the fire subsided, the burned bones and ashes were meticulously gathered and either spread in a stone-lined grave or interred in an urn. However, cremation was more than simply a way to appease the gods. It was useful as well. Fire made sense. In communities with limited space or where wild animals threatened shallow burials, not to mention the psychological aspect, cremation prevented the dead from coming back. Revenants, undead warriors, and restless spirits abound in Norse mythology. Haunting was less common when a body was reduced to ash. Inhumation, or the burial of whole remains, increased in popularity throughout time, notably during the late Viking era, especially as Christianity gained traction. Inhumation was more consistent with Christian concepts of corporeal preservation and resurrection. However, even before Christianity, certain Viking societies preferred to bury their dead in wooden coffins, ships, or rooms with the body spread out, fully clothed and surrounded by equipment, commodities, and animals. It's interesting that both approaches frequently coexisted. For example, a chieftain may be incinerated on a hill while his wife is buried nearby, or warriors may be cremated while farmers and traders are inhumed. The decision may be a reflection of regional custom, socioeconomic status, or personal identity. The honor and attention to detail were what bound the two rites together. Regardless of how they decided to enter the next world, the Viking dead were reverently regarded as travelers. Whether they were sealed under a mound or converted to smoke, funerals for Vikings were not a quiet event. They were ceremonial farewells that included narrative, singing, toasts, and symbolic actions. The rites of the living were equally as significant as the actual care of the deceased, which included burning, burial, and loading onto ships. It was one thing to die well, but immortality another to be remembered correctly. Songs and poetry were crucial to many Viking funerals. Poets or scrolls were essential in keeping the memories of the departed alive. They wrote eogis and funeral stanzas that described the individual's actions, ancestry, triumphs, and even peculiarities. These were not only melancholy verses, they modeled the deceased after story heroes, making them grandiose. Did you even die a Viking if you weren't sang about at your own funeral? Ritual toasting was another aspect of funerals, referred to as the minnie. Drinking horns were exchanged, me flowed, and every toast paid tribute to the gods' ancestors, and fate itself in addition to the deceased. These were somber times, but they were also intensely communal, combining grief with friendship. It was sorrow communicated through fermented honey and firelight. At the tomb site, offerings were offered, perhaps in the form of food, weapons, or blood, in order to support or lead the soul in the hereafter. Sacrifices, particularly of animals, may be made in conjunction with the burial. These rites were frequently led by vulvar or Gothic priests who used symbolic gestures, chants, and sometimes a few unprintable incantations. Ritualized performances occurred at more affluent funerals. The burial of a Rust chieftain, perhaps. Norsemen who lived along the Volga was notably detailed by the Arab envoy Ibn Fadlan in the 10th century. It included days of preparation, animal sacrifices, and the ceremonial death of a slave girl who offered to go with her master. It demonstrates the dramatic and theological importance the Vikings placed on death rites, despite the fact that it is horrible by today's standards. Weeks later, memorial feasts could finally be held. These are used to respect the heritage, resolve disputes, and transfer property. Stories may be repeated, vows taken, and new leaders named. Death was more than simply a setback to the Vikings. They had a tale to tell, a song to sing, and a life to celebrate with voice, fire, and alcohol. Stone kept the name intact, while singing transported the spirit, and fire devoured the body. Viking culture did not leave memory up to chance. it was, etched into the earth's very bones, letter by letter. One of the longest-lasting Viking customs of all the runestone emerged as a result. Gravestones, in the contemporary sense, were not runstones. A little marker wasn't what you were putting next to a plot. You were building a memorial for the public to see, read, and honor. These stones, which boldly declared the life and legacy of the deceased, stood beside burial mounds, at crossroads, next to bridges, and along roadways. Runic script, an alphabet utilized across the Norse realm, was employed to write the inscriptions. Some were easy. This stone was built by Gunnar in honor of his brother. Others were huge epics that described adventures, conflicts, and actions. For anyone who ventured to move or deface the stone, some even added curses. May your bones deteriorate and your livestock stop producing milk if you move this stone. The Vikings were serious. Additionally, some stones commemorated traders, tourists, and even ladies, while many others honored soldiers and chieftains. The Danish gelling stones are a well-known example. King Harald Bluetooth constructed enormous runstones to commemorate his parents and proclaim Denmark Christian. They demonstrate how runstones changed over time by fusing pagan custom with the developing Christian influence. Carving a runestone was not an inexpensive task. It took time, a heavy block of stone, typically sandstone or granite, and a talented rune master. However, eternity was the prize. Their words, even centuries later, continue to resonate. This life mattered. This person will not be forgotten. To raise a runestone was to express this sentiment. Images, ships, weapons, animals, or symbols of authority were included on certain runstones. Others twisted runes into dragon curves or snake patterns, which were more abstract. The message itself made a statement, but so did the craftsmanship. The runestone served as a tangible anchor and an indelible memory etched into the environment itself in an oral culture where the majority of stories were transmitted orally. Despite their fortitude and stoicism, the Vikings had a persistent terror that was difficult to overcome by fire, stone, or sword. The dead who refused to remain dead, because not all spirits went away in peace, according to Norse religion. Some stayed, others came back, and still others wouldn't go. They were the restless, dragger, dead, rising from the graves with blazing eyes, bloated bodies, and a highly negative attitude. They weren't fluffy apparitions. They were tangible, deadly, and spiteful, known to crush bones, shatter doors, and occasionally sit on sleeping victims like a sweaty rock of fury. The Viking equivalent of a horror film, with the possibility that you know the man from your community. What made someone turn into a dragger, typically a terrible life or death. The ideal candidates were those who were aggressive, greedy, or dishonorable. Those with unresolved matters were also affected. A sword debt, retaliation, jealousy, or simply a strong dislike for their family members. A dissatisfied ghost might also be the outcome of a poorly planned funeral. The deceased may choose to check in again if the grave items were stolen or if the burial rites were not properly carried out. Viking burials featured protective rites to avoid this. Occasionally, massive stones were placed on top of the body to physically pin it down while it was buried. Other graves exhibit evidence of spear or stake punctures, a precautionary measure that would have pleased any contemporary vampire hunter. The corpse was completely destroyed during cremations, not just for cleansing, but also to eliminate the shape the Droger may reincarnate in. Not all lingering dead, however, were malevolent. Some were ancestral spirits that guarded family domains or provided direction. If handled with care, these spirits, also known as Philor or Disiae, may provide protection. At graveyards, they were frequently remembered with silent prayers and seasonal offerings. There was tension even in the afterlife. A warrior's soul may fight in Valhalla for all eternity, which may seem wonderful until you realize it's a never-ending battle with no weekends. Even in death, the Vikings welcomed the concept of struggle. Death, after all, was never just a conclusion. It was a narrative, a haunting, a warning, and a beginning. The deceased never really died. They persisted after you in smoke, song, stone, and occasionally unexpected footfall.